Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Did everybody have a good 2 weeks off? So welcome back to really what is the second half of our exploration of the Crusades. And as I think I commented in our second session, and then moving forward, is that of course no battle plan ever survives contact with the enemy. And so today we're doing the second and third Crusades, but next week we're going to stick with the third Crusade and moving to the fourth, and go beyond that. And part of the reason is, just before we get into things, if you look at the overall timing in terms of the historical period, there was one crusade in the 11th century, there were two crusades in the 12th century, and there were 6 crusades, at least, in the 13th century, and so on. And the distance in time, the time difference between, or the gap between the first and second crusade was 50 years. The gap between the second and third crusade was 40 years. The gap between the third and fourth crusade was 10 years, and it just kind of stacked. It just seems to be that suddenly the Pope was calling a crusade for every slight, and that is part of the aftermath and history that we're going to be working through. But because there's such a space, a time differential between them, there's a lot that happens in between the Crusades, because it isn't the campaign that is important, but what led up to it and what happens after. So this is as much, you may almost find this anticlimactic in terms of what happened during the Crusade itself, while they fought. It won't be quite like that, but there's a bit of a play at that. So I'm just putting up where we're at, and then again for next week, as I said, we're going to go into the third crusade, and then come back to the third crusade and move into the fourth crusade and beyond, and then in the aftermath and legacy. And this may actually also cover, this may be a blend where we'll be jumping a little bit back and forth in terms of some of those timelines. So before we get into this, do we have any questions from the past 3 weeks now?
You seem to have forgotten how the first crusade ended. Could you kindly recap that for us?
That's actually exactly what I'm doing right now. The Battle of Ascalon was the very last military engagement of what was considered to be the First Crusade. And that was August 12th, 1099. Now, in this particular case, it was a movement against the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. But Ascalon, I'm not sure if I don't think I have a map coming up here just yet. But it's southwest of Jerusalem. And it was a military outpost. This was an on-the-field battle where the Crusaders defeated a numerically superior force of the Fatimids, but the Fatimids themselves were not as battle experienced as the First Crusaders, as the Crusaders themselves. Plus, they were also politically weak, had alienated themselves as far as allies are concerned. I'll get into that a little bit more. What ended up happening is the creation of what ended up becoming called the Outremer, or probably better in English, the Crusader States. And they had to remember, as they were coming through, this was an overland campaign. And as they were coming through, they had stopped for resupply and for organization in Constantinople. And there were assurances given to the Byzantine Emperor that any lands they captured would be returned to the Byzantine Empire. Maruf, I was going back to your very first question. Was Jerusalem Jerusalem in terms of was Jerusalem under Christian control. Yes, it was from the time of Constantine. You know, technically, it would be from the time of Constantine up until the conquests. So there was this period of about, probably in the neighborhood of about 300 to 400 years that it was. However, it was not under Roman control. It was under, effectively, Byzantine control. In other words, Eastern Orthodox. We do get into a little bit of that. So the answer to that is yes and no. Was it under Christian control? Yes, but not Roman Christian control. And there was a difference. Now, unfortunately, well, what happened is, in the aftermath of the siege of Antioch, any sort of loyalty that the Crusaders might have had to the Byzantine Empire evaporated. And so, as a result, the territorial ambitions that many of them came with anyway, they no longer felt fettered by that promise that they had made to the Byzantine Emperor, and so de facto, they ended up creating countries of their own. And of course, we had their own designs, but we had the County of Edessa, which was the first to be created through some machinations by Baldwin of Boulogne. The Principality of Antioch, after Antioch itself was captured, and the siege of Antioch on the part of Kerboga and the Turks had successfully been put off. When Jerusalem was conquered, the area around it became the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And then, because the governor of Tripoli had promised the Crusaders that if they took Jerusalem, he would then basically turn over control to them, that created the County of Tripoli. So there are actually 4 Crusader states that were created. And so, this is the Mediterranean Sea right here. That is the island of Crete, just for reference. Cyprus. Sorry. Yeah, Crete. It's Cyprus. That's Cyprus. That's what I meant to say. Now, if you look carefully here, there's actually 4 red crosses. These, the County of Edessa is here, the Principality of Antioch, Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the little one here is the County of Tripoli. Those ones are called the Crusader states, although the Principality of Armenian Cilicia was also a Christian state as well, but not specifically a Crusader state. It had its origins outside of the Crusades. But there was a little bit of back and forth going on, and really they were themselves Eastern Orthodox Christians. These were Latin Rite Christians, Roman Catholic. Latin Rite is probably the better. Calling them Roman Catholic is a little bit anachronistic at the moment, although that would be what we would understand. But Latin Rite Christians. Their worship services, their mass was in Latin as opposed to Greek, or a local language. So this, now, because of the lingua franca, as it was known, a lot of French terms were used with this, and it was often referred to as the outre-mer, which was the overseas lands. But for the purposes of this, it's easier for me to actually say Crusader states. My daughter and my wife speak French, and I do not. Or at least not well. Now, this map, unfortunately, you don't see all that well. This is Europe, France, Holy Roman Empire. This red mark here is the territory that was regained by the Byzantine Empire in the aftermath of the Crusades. See, the Byzantine Empire actually gained a lot, they were the ones who, their actions started the crusade, even though that's not what they had planned. All they wanted to do was get territory back that had been lost after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. they didn't expect the crusade, and so their whole, as the Crusaders went through, they slowly went behind them and consolidated their power. And so, in fact, because of course Byzantine politics are what they are, they're very good negotiators. They're also very good at, they knew how to run an empire. And so as a result, they did actually manage to reclaim, not all, but most of the territory that was lost after the Battle of Mansfield. The only part that didn't was just this center area. And you had in there the Dashaminid Empire and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome that had been reduced in strength. But so they still weren't able to reclaim the interior, but they claimed the coastlines, which.
Excuse me, John.
Yes.
Are you saying that the western part of Turkey, present day Turkey, was then taken back by the Byzantines?
Pretty much, yes.
Except Anatolia.
Except Anatolia itself. Like it almost looks like. Okay, the red area, you can kind of see this almost like two fingers sticking out here.
Yeah.
This gap was still controlled by Turks or the Dashminids. This center area here, but they did manage to reclaim probably about a third of Asia Minor, Anatolia itself, but certainly not all of it, because Manzikert is out here. So they didn't quite get all of it back, but they got a lot of it back. And if you actually look carefully, it's kind of like that right here overlaps some of the Crusader states. I get to that. And the other thing is, because the Crusaders came roaring through, the pressure that the Byzantine Empire actually felt against the Seljuk Empire, both the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome and the larger Seljuk Empire, a lot of that pressure was relieved, so that they were actually free to pursue other campaigns, whether it was up into Romania or to simply do what they do best and negotiate a lot and sign treaties. And so it really did free them up, and of course consolidating the power. The Europeans themselves, of course, created four independent states that were there's my incomplete sentence of a slide that didn't quite get done. But the establishment of territories, effectively colonies, even though this is the very much predates the colonial period by 400 years. Easily 400 years, that this effectively was almost like a pre-colonial effort. Of course, once you have the Eastern Mediterranean, you have all of these goods. And keep in mind, this was the golden age of Islam in terms of economics, in terms of prosperity, in terms of science, in terms of all of this kind of knowledge. The Europeans were barbarians. I mean, literally, they were barbarians. I mean, they were descended from them. But by comparison. And so this opened up all kinds of goods that Europeans had never seen before. And so that it actually established all kinds of new trade routes and the like. But on the downside, they also brought with them their own system of politics coming back in. But I mean, as far as the Europeans were concerned, that's a game. We bring our system there. Now, here's the thing. What did the church gain out of this? Well, they got Jerusalem. That was an actual stated goal. The trouble is, Urban II never actually saw it. Even though Jerusalem fell before Urban II died, news of the fall of Jerusalem did not get back to Rome until after he was dead. So he never actually saw, Urban II never actually saw that goal. Now, here's the thing. The power of the Roman papacy was then extended into the East, into areas that it never had been before. Of course, the cost was high. We had examples of massacres. There are stories of cannibalism out of the Siege of Antioch. Some things that, and of course, the People's Crusade itself was just horrible. And whatever moral authority it seemed that the papacy might have claimed was tarnished by this. And perhaps, if you can't see it down there, that says unguided enthusiasm. A euphemism for a mob. And of course, we have the Rhineland massacres. Even though the papacy said, stop doing that, and they did actually have to call in other forces to defend these Jewish communities, but the defense wasn't swift enough. They didn't anticipate it, even though perhaps they probably should have. And of course, the Rhineland massacres are often seen as a precursor to a lot of the anti-Jewish pogroms that would happen over the next 1,000 years, culminating in the Holocaust. So that was big. Now, here's the thing. One of the goals that the papacy actually wanted was a reconciliation or a reunification of the Eastern and Western Church. This was specifically a goal for Urban II, and he had actually tasked Bishop Adhemar himself to try and facilitate that. And Adhemar worked very hard, even though he himself was a military commander. If you look at the diplomat, he was also a very good diplomat. And one of the things that he was trying to do was he was working with Christians regardless of what rite they used. And he was really working hard for that. In fact, there is one example. After Antioch was taken back, he reinstalled the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch. He had also been working with the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Remember how the church really had 5 different major centers of control: Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome. Well, they had all kind of gone a little bit their own ways. But the thing is, these churches did still have their own built-in hierarchies. And so he was also working with the exiled Patriarch of Jerusalem, who is in Cyprus. And Adhemar actually got the Patriarch of Jerusalem to write about news and for letters of support as the Crusades were happening. This was very intentional on his part. And he was, through all of this, he's trying to repair the damage that was done in 1054. And then he dies. And all the work that he did, gone. Because the thing is, he didn't tell enough people that that's what he was doing. Because, unfortunately, during this time, the European combat forces were learning to distrust the Byzantines, because the Byzantines talked to people. And they were very good at it, and they were also very good at playing both sides off the middle. And that's one of the things that they worked at. They were great negotiators. And so in this distrust, following the Siege of Antioch, after Adhemar dies, what happens when they get to Jerusalem? Not only do they kill everybody. Now, yes, Christians were kicked out of the city prior to the siege itself. But after they take Jerusalem, the surviving Crusaders, instead of reinstalling the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the papacy and they established a Latin patriarch of Jerusalem, basically usurping the power. So that didn't go over well with Eastern Christians either. But one thing about the First Crusades, after this, all future crusades were based on the success of the first, because they were successful in reaching the goal that they had set out to do. Every other crusade would not have happened in the same way without the success of the first. And of course, to the victors go the spoils, to the victors go the story. And so the Crusaders that returned to Europe were hailed as heroes. Now, you might remember that we also talked about that during the siege of Antioch, there was a great big morale breakdown. Several fled, including Stephen of Blois, who actually encountered the Byzantine emperor on the way and said, "Oh, don't bother," and they went home. News got back to Constantinople that they actually took Jerusalem. He felt so bad about it that he did actually a little minor crusade of his own on behalf of the Byzantines to claim back territory, and that's how they got some of that territory back. That happened right around that point. But the Crusaders that did return to Europe, the ones that did not choose to stay in and around Jerusalem, in the territories that they had created, they were hailed as heroes. And of course, the chivalry, the knight, all the good stuff, romanticized, exaggerated, that got back to Europe. And poets began writing about it. You have even a series called the Crusades cycle. And I mean, some of it was just simply historical accounting. But for those of you like me who play Dungeons and Dragons, the stories of the dragons and knights and chivalry and all that evolved out of this. Now, it didn't actually come out of the Middle East. That was an invention of the poets in and around France. But it captured people's imagination and downplayed the bad parts, if not just downplayed, like ignored them. So there's my touch to Dungeons and Dragons there. Yes, I'm a United Church minister, and yes, I play Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to stick to that. But of course, all the bad stuff didn't make it back. And I really need to emphasize this. The horrible nature of what happened in the Crusades, that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happened in Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem. Sort of. Because, of course, there was the other side. And one of the reasons why the First Crusade was so successful, because if you look at the number of troops that the Western forces actually committed, by the time Jerusalem was taken, it was amazing that they actually did anything at all, because the forces were really quite meager. But the reality is that all the various Islamic powers that were there, the states, the city-states, the governors, they were all fighting amongst themselves when the Crusaders rolled through. They didn't take them seriously enough, soon enough, and suddenly found themselves, what just happened? And so, some of the fights that they were having, like the Seljuks in the Sultanate in Asia Minor were too busy fighting the Dashmids. The Seljuks were fighting the Fatimids. And then even in the Seljuk Empire, the governors were fighting amongst themselves as to who was actually going to control stuff. And of course, they interpreted their loss as a sign of God's displeasure. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention is on the way there, certain things that were happening as the morale went up and down amongst the Crusaders is that they read their successes but also their failures, which did happen, as signs of God's pleasure and displeasure. But also this happened, one of the things, here's my astronomy hobby coming in. Yes, I'm a multi-talented nerd. This was also a year in which sunspot activity was very, very high in terms of that 11-year cycle. And so northern lights were happening like crazy. There were lunar eclipses going on. There was all kinds of stuff going on in the heavens that really, and you put that to a superstitious population on both sides, and you're willing to, you're going to get a lot of interpretation going on there. And of course, while the news of the massacre of Jerusalem did not filter back to Europe, it certainly did through the Islamic world. These Europeans are fanatics, they're not to be trusted, they're all out to kill us. Now, the thing is, eventually they learned to trade with us, by the way. And so while there was a call to respond, it would, without exaggeration, it took decades. Remember, I told you it was 50 years between the First Crusade and the Second Crusade. And so really we have this long, now I put peace in quotation marks because it wasn't. But in terms of the time between when an actual crusade was, the end of the previous crusade and the calling of the next one was this time period. And so the Crusader states took advantage of the weakness of the various Islamic powers and were able to actually establish viable kingdoms, viable counties, viable principality, that they became established. And there was, but of course, as with any, the same thing was happening in Europe. There were always this kind of pull and tug of conflict between each other. I mean, it actually ended up looking a lot like Europe in this time as well. There were skirmishes, really. Now here's the other thing: is because the Crusaders didn't honor that agreement. Imagine what the Byzantine Emperor thought. And so he did not recognize the right for any of these Crusader states, like, all that territory you captured, that's mine. Okay, so the very first thing that the Crusader states did was piss off their benefactor. And so, again, the Byzantines had moved along to establish control over the territories, but they also wanted to bring the Crusader states under their own control. And so in the process, they did actually establish a case where the Armenian Cilicia and the County of Edessa, through various machinations, eventually they established control over, these two became vassal states of the Byzantine Empire. And so as a result, you now had also Christians versus Christians here. So 1105 is when those two northern states, the Crusader state of Edessa and Cilicia, officially became vassals. They were still technically independent, but if the Byzantine emperor said jump, they'd say, how high and how far, and what shoes do you want me to wear? So, why a Second Crusade in the first place if this was so established? Well, again, the Second and the Third and the Fourth and the Fifth and the Sixth and the Seventh and the Eighth and the Ninth Crusade were all responses to territorial losses of what happened in the First Crusade, or responses to territorial losses in what happened in the previous crusade. But really, it was all about economics and political power. I mean, there was a religious overtone to this because of the centrality of Jerusalem in terms of pilgrims and the like, but it was economics. You open up trade routes like that, they are lucrative. And of course, I mentioned this point before. And in this case, this is where you had the rise of both the Venetian Navy and the Genoese Navy themselves became very powerful merchant and military naval regimes of their own, because traveling over land, as the Crusaders found out, is hard. Traveling by sea, minus some storms, is easier and faster for that matter. And so any of the routes that were established became more established by sea, because the Crusader states had established ports. Acre, Tripoli, and the like. And so the Venetians and the Genoese and a handful of others established trading ports. In fact, the Venetians established the first mass production facility of ships that could actually turn out a ship a day. Pre-industrial. And they were able to do that. One ship per day, which, you know, that's a fantastic production rate. And they really established themselves. And not only that, they had the money to do it, because it was this mercantile system. And not only that, they were learning from the various Islamic powers that were the Fatimids and the others, in terms of things about shipbuilding, but also mercantile and trade. You know, like you also have things like, the goods from the Middle East were very exotic and not something that they would have seen in Europe. And so there was a lot of demand that eventually built up for this. So again, the Venetians, the Genoese themselves had interests here. And so there was an economic, throughout the rest of the Crusade, what's called the Crusading period, and frankly beyond that, was a big economic part of it, and specifically merchant marine. Of course, you didn't have to worry about Turks getting to Jerusalem, on the way to Jerusalem. However, you had the port, Jaffa, and then Jerusalem was in the inland, so the pilgrims still had to walk from Jaffa inland to Jerusalem. And you've heard, everybody knows what a bandit is. Everybody knows what a highwayman is. Well, quite often, these pilgrims, who were carrying quite often all they had, were rich targets for bandits and highwaymen, and it mattered not who they were. And so there developed this entire economy to actually protect them. So about 20 years after the fall of Jerusalem, this knight, Hugh de Payne, went to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and the Latin patriarch, Warmond. He said, I think we could create a monastic order that could protect pilgrims on the way, and that is their role. And so both the king and the patriarch said, hey, this is a good idea. And did I mention that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque that it's still in Jerusalem, it's built on the Temple Mount. So it's built on the site where Solomon's temple was. That was turned into it was no longer a mosque, it was turned into the royal palace. And he said, well, we've got some rooms down there that you could use. And so they gave them a wing in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which at that point in time was the royal palace of Jerusalem. And this group was called, their official title was the Poor Knights of Christ in the Temple of Solomon. The Knights Templar, maybe you've heard of them. And individual members took a vow of poverty to aid and protect, but this became the largest charity in Europe. There's all kinds of politicking that went on behind. Anybody who was part of the Knights Hospitaller, or another group, the Knights Templar, took personal vows of poverty, but the organization became very rich. And they also created the first example of credit, that anybody going on a future crusade could basically hand all their possessions in, get a note for it, travel with said note, and when they got to their destination, they could hand it over and get the equivalent in goods back for having done that. And that was actually very good, because bandits would come and say, you know, what have you got? Most of them were illiterate, and so this piece of paper is useless to me, and you know, they let them go. And that sense of credit was actually something that it was a primitive form of banking, but it worked. Curiously enough, only 10% of them were knights. The rest of them, it was this big, massive infrastructure. So, all this economics and trade had been set up. But of course, time is what it is. First, second, third law of thermodynamics. I've been told the biggest ones are you can't win, you can't break even, you can't stop. In other words, in terms of the concept of entropy, everything changes. Things like don't hold steady. It eventually does break down and change. Same thing happens in politics. And after 50 years, you had these shifts in power. You had these northern states becoming under the control of the Byzantine Empire. Eventually, the Muslim states would unify. We do actually get to how they did that. But of course, the stories of what happened in Jerusalem did get out. In fact, one of the stories that's told is that the Quran from the Al-Aqsa Mosque was actually was smuggled out of Jerusalem by refugees who took it to Damascus. And they presented it to a scholar in Damascus. And this scholar was, very concerned. And so he tried to take the concern directly to Baghdad, to the Caliph. And I mean, at this point in time, keep in mind that the Islamic, all the various Islamic powers were fighting with each other, but they did nominally acknowledge the power of the opposite Caliph. The news comes back, and as the story goes, he tried to see the Caliph, and the Caliph wouldn't, they wouldn't let him in. So he devised a scheme. Curiously enough, as it is currently, it was Ramadan. And one of the practices in Ramadan is you feast or you fast during daylight. He walks into the main mosque in Damascus with a bag of lunch. And sits down and starts to eat, and of course, this gets their attention. And he is dragged before the Caliph, and at that point he actually argues to the Caliph. The trouble is that the Caliph himself was a figurehead. He didn't have the power, and unfortunately, at the time, it didn't go anywhere. And there would be a number of false starts to try and unify. But it wouldn't be until 3 decades later that anything of any significance would actually happen. And of course, despite the fact that the Europeans got a reputation for being barbarians, there were shrewd traders on both sides that said, well, you've got goods, we've got money. And so trade, of course, did begin to happen. Control of the routes, the control of the economics, the taxation of that became more the political powers. But of course, as mentioned before, the various Islamic powers were at odds with each other. And alliances shifted back and forth. I mean, you almost had to keep a scorecard as to who was allied with who at any given time. And even then, you would be wrong. Because, of course, like for example, the Principality of Antioch took on the Byzantine Empire because the Byzantine Emperor said, that's ours. And the folks in Antioch went, no. And then you have the County of Edessa forming an alliance with the Arcad dynasty, which is an Islamic power against the Zengid Seljuk, the Zengid dynasty, which were Seljuk Turks. You also had the rulers of Damascus allying with the kingdom of Jerusalem against the Seljuk Turks. If this was purely a religious war, then these were allies across, like not just they were allies across faith traditions here. And of course, we do know that the Fatimids also actively traded with various Crusader states as well. But then again, so did the Turks. So very complicated, and there was all kinds of trading going back and forth. So but at the same time, who would control was more the political question. And of course, this one I've mentioned a dozen times already.
No, excuse me,
Yes.
that has to do with the trade.
Yes.
What I know is that the Jews played a very significant part in the negotiations and setting up the various trade linkages across states. Is that correct?
I haven't seen anything that would deny that, and I think there may have been a certain amount of truth to that. I need to double check that, because the sources that I've been working with, certainly in Europe, because Jews were forbidden to own land in Europe, they became very rich in liquid capital, and were known as money lenders, for good or for ill. And unfortunately helped perpetuate some negative stereotypes. There were definitely Jews in Jerusalem at the time that the Crusaders came, and they fought alongside the Muslims again in Jerusalem against the Crusaders. But at the same time, you had, I think it was, you had also asked, what did they do to repopulate Jerusalem? And the answer was immigrants from Europe became part of that, as well as immigrants, pulling people in from the countryside. Were there Jewish people in that? Most certainly. What precise role they have, I don't have any information, so I want to double check that. But thank you for bringing that up, because the trade relations were probably one of the big things driving a lot of the background of this, and one of the reasons why peace lasted as long as it did. So over time, the attempts to unify the various Islamic dynasties and the states wasn't all that successful. But this, we have al-Din Zayn, and from here on in, I'm just referring to him as Zayn, because apparently that's how his way is referred to. But quite often you have you have very long names, and then you get that you have to reduce down to a nickname. For example, one that I know that John's been waiting for is Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. You do get nicknames, but some of the Islamic names were in much the same way within Arabic. Were quite long. They were often shortened to a single name. So it's simply a naming convention. So Zayd's father had been governor of Aleppo, but he himself was actually raised by Kerboga. Now Kerboga, you might remember from 2 weeks ago, was the guy who was the ruler who laid siege to Antioch after the Crusaders had taken Antioch. But the trouble is that he had his own territorial ambitions, and the other governors didn't trust him, and so they left him high and dry. And the Crusaders inside Antioch met them on the battlefield and actually defeated Kerboga, basically shattering his territorial ambitions in the Seljuk Empire itself. And there we go. But of course, Kerboga retreated back to Mosul. And, but of course, he would have certainly passed along those territorial ambitions back to Mosul. Because Mosul and Aleppo were actually quite were linked politically, and so Zengi becomes the governor of Mosul in 1127 and Aleppo in 1128, and he had huge territorial ambitions. And normally, Islamic rulers at the time that had territorial ambitions often raised the suspicion of other governors, and quite often they would ally against them. It was no different for Zengi. Zengi was better at it than most. And so he started reclaiming a lot of the territory that Kerboga had lost. And he wanted Damascus, but he also tried having a vassal in the Archid Empire, or the Archid dynasty to the north. And in this time, of course, his forces would also become in conflict with the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Byzantine Empire during various times. It was really skirmishes, skirmishes were still, these were still battles, but they weren't these huge, decisive. They were more of a, and curiously enough, both the Byzantine Empire and the Kingdom of Jerusalem had allied with the governor of Damascus against Zengi. So again, here's that alliance, cross-fading alliance that happened. And Zengi himself, at the time, didn't really want, he saw the Crusader states as an inconvenience, but what he wanted was to solidify his own power base. And he wanted Damascus. But most of the territorial ambitions he had were all in what was already Islamic-controlled regions. But if taking action against a Crusader state would satisfy some security in order to be able to realize his other ambitions, then he would go for it. The trigger was the city of Edessa. The county of Edessa, as mentioned before, because it was landlocked. I mean, I've got a couple of things. Because it was landlocked, because it was further away from the various ports. It was dependent upon trade, but it had no access to water itself. And they weren't particularly on good terms with the Principality of Antioch. Remember, they were all crusading together, and once they got their own kingdoms, they fractured. And so, in order, he lost his allies. Actually, I'm going to bring this back. The king of Jerusalem died, and the Byzantine emperor died, and they were Edessa's primary means of support. And when he lost those, Jocelyn III, I think, became involved in helping the Archids against Zengi. Because if I help them, you'll help me defend my own territory, whether it's against the Seljuks of Rome or Zengi himself. So he moved a lot of his forces out of Edessa. Now, Edessa, the entire population of the region was maybe 10,000. It was not very much at all. So even moving a fort, he didn't leave enough of a garrison behind him at Edessa. And Zengi figured this out. And so while the army was moving north to engage him, he just simply avoided it and went south and laid siege to Edessa, which fell on December 24th, 1144. This was the triggering event for the Second Crusade. The trouble is the Second Crusade didn't actually get underway until 3 years later. But this is the triggering event. Sorry, it was Jocelyn II. My points were appearing out of order. So, Edessa falls at the end of 1144. News comes back to Europe by roughly the middle of 1145. Because first off, the news had to get down to Antioch. Then, now remember, news travels as fast as the fastest mobile, like by ship or by horse. So it takes time for news to filter back. Now Jocelyn himself, even though Edessa fell, the county of Edessa still existed because he simply moved his capital to a smaller city to the west. And in essence, what was there was this appeal to the west to help us because Jerusalem, the kingdom of Jerusalem was now in a weaker state. The Byzantines weren't any help as far as they were concerned. And all this time, Zengi's forces are gaining more and more territory. So basically, Zengi is establishing, as far as he's concerned, he's not going after Edessa specifically. He's just establishing control so that he can move his forces down to Damascus. That's what he wanted. And so so he goes to strengthen his flank, and so several appeals travel to the west. And of course they're all fighting with each other, and they're not in great shape. So news gets back to Pope Eugene III. Now Eugene III, curiously enough, is in trouble himself because of some of the things that he's doing. He wasn't welcome in Rome, so he was actually running the papacy down the road, so to speak. But part of it is similar to Urban II, needing to reestablish his own control. And so in December of 1145, so nearly a full year later, he calls for crusade. What do you think the reaction was? That was about it. That was the reaction. The Pope says, indulgences for anybody who will go and reclaim Edessa. And everybody kind of goes, why? And partly it's because he was, you also in the West also weak. This part I mentioned already. He does offer the same indulgences that Urban II had done 50 years before. But it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux who became Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. I can't hear Saint Bernard without thinking of the dog. But in March, Bernard of Clairvaux is in France, and he preaches crusade with the King of France present. The King of France, Louis VII. Decides, you know what? I'm going. If you had such a poor reaction, I'm going to go. So the King of France decides to go on crusade. And eventually, because of that, Conrad III, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Germany, effectively, said, well, if he's going, I guess I've got to go too. So, unlike the First Crusade, where you had lesser, high nobles, but they weren't like top rank nobles. They were second tier. Here you have the rulers of France and the Holy Roman Emperor saying, yes, we're going to go on a crusade. And so they began getting the forces together and mustering them together. And this time they actually learned some lessons from the previous crusade. And unfortunately, when Bernard of Clairvaux began preaching crusade, some began to say, well, there's a bunch of infidels right here. Let's go after them again. fairly complex, and it's specifically a Roman Catholic, a medieval Roman Catholic thing. At least in the context that I'm using here. To make a very long story short, it's a get out of hell free card. Would be the best way to describe it. In essence, it's an act of piety. One does an act of piety, and then someone else will pray for you in exchange for that act of piety. And that's when. So if I go on this pilgrimage, somebody else will pray for my soul, so that I get out of. It's not hell specifically, purgatory. That's sort of middle ground.
What about the wealth that I think of the Crusaders as acquiring when we got on the Crusade? Was there great wealth and plunder that they took back to the past?
Yes and no. Most of the wealth that actually kind of came that developed out of that was mostly from merchant trade. But did they plunder? Yes, they did. And certainly the fact of the establishment of the Crusader states was part of that. Is not only did they plunder what they took, instead of looting it, they said, we're going to stay here and we're going to milk it for all it's worth. And that's where the economics of trade came in. So the trade routes is technically part of that plunder, although not as violent, I suppose. But it could be violent enough. So there was, going back to this, there was actually an aggressive campaign to actually stamp out mob violence before it happened, because of the lessons of what happened with the People's Crusade. There were attacks on Jewish communities. In particular, there was a French monk who then went into the Rhineland that actually actively preached local crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux himself went, found Rudolph, and said, "You're coming with me." And we never heard from him again. Unlike the Rhineland massacres, in this case, yes, it happened, but by comparison to the Rhineland massacres during the People's Crusade, a life is a life is a life, but in this case, it was merely about a few hundred as opposed to thousands. But, of course, with any military campaign set in a state in a time where communications was delivered by foot, preparation takes time. So, here's our timeline. First Battle Crusade, December 1145, nobody bats an eye. It's reissued in March 1146, and then that's when the rallying activity started. The planning for it happened, the get together and what are we going to do and when are we going to leave, happened in 1147, in February. Departure date, June 1147. So keep in mind the precipitating event happened a year before in 1144. So we're 3 years into it. And it wouldn't be until the early 1148 that these forces would start landing in the Crusader states. This was a long, we tend to think of military campaigns kind of happening quick, because we can turn on the news and find out what's going on exactly, halfway around the world, or all the way around the world, very, very quickly. And for us to think in these terms, it's kind of, wow, that's been a long time. It was slow, funny.
Just wondering, so you're looking at 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
How long was the first crusade? I know it was more of a, let's just all get together, but how much time they spent thinking about the first one?
Well, the first crusade was about like its official period is 1095 to 1099. But because it was over land, there's a lot more going on with that. Plus, you had like the route across Europe was complete. Was this just, especially with the People's Crusade, was this rolling disaster.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like this here we got planning, but being talking to that. And I'm also like, I get the sense that it was peaceful enough in Europe that they had the opportunity to get together and do the plan.
Yes.
There's all these little skirmishes, the little fights, and this one didn't like that one, and all that was going on. So that must have been sort of a peaceful, quieter time in Europe. So the king could go and kind of tell them, oh, let's go fight.
Yeah, and the answer to that was mostly. And there's some of that skirmishing and some of those disagreements that actually come into play and how they got there. This is the overall route of the direction that the armies traveled in the Second Crusade. And you notice here, this is an overland route, and then you had a sea route as well. Well, the basic way to describe this is that the French came by sea and the Germans came by land. Because Conrad III, going straight to your question about conflicts, had some serious disagreement with the various naval powers. They didn't like it. They were technically at war with each other. And so, I can't get on their ships. They might throw us overboard. Whereas the French had no problem with that. Granted, they did convene in Constantinople, and as with the First Crusade, Manuel I, or Manuel, I think would be the more proper pronunciation of it, was the Byzantine emperor at the time, and said, any territory you claim, mine. You don't want to hear it. So when they actually got to when the actual Second Crusade happened, we've been building up to the Second Crusade, and we got one slide. Because the Byzantines remembered what happened the last time, and the Byzantines actually negotiated peace with one of the Seljuk powers and said, "Be at peace. We got to go deal with something." And they mustered their forces against the Crusaders. Now they didn't actually fight them, but they were prepared because they remembered the last time. The German forces went through Asia Minor, and at what was now referred to as the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, they lost a significant amount of their forces in a skirmish with the Turks on the way there, because they didn't understand the fighting style of the Turks, whereas those in the crusading states actually had battle experience with them. And get this, the Crusaders in the planning stages said, you know what, we're going to do this, but we're not going to take Edessa back. The whole point of the crusade was what they instigated was the fall of Edessa. No, they didn't want to go to Edessa. In fact, they wanted to take Damascus. Now remember, there's somebody else in the Islamic areas that go, I want Damascus. And so the Crusaders went to lay siege with Damascus against somebody they had already been allied with against the Turks to take Damascus. Instead of maybe getting Damascus' help against the Turks and going into Edessa, no, they said, no, we're going to take it themselves. And I'm looking at this going, how dumb can you be? And keep in mind, there are not one, but two kings, like top-end rulers here, that don't get it. And so, the big battle of the Second Crusade was the siege of Edessa. Edessa? Oh, sorry, it was the siege of Damascus. Did I say Edessa?
Yes.
Anyway. And of course, by doing this, effectively, the Crusaders basically handed Damascus on a platter to, in this case, what would end up being not Zengi himself, but his son. Here you go, on a platter. And they had a plan of assaulting Damascus. They said, well, hey, there's a bunch of orchards to the west. We'll set up there, we'll have lots of food, lots of water. And then some rocket scientist in the middle of that said, no, we should move to the east side of Damascus where it's desert. And that didn't go well. So, it was just, it was, like I said, we build up to the Second Crusade and we get to this and it's just like, And it was a disaster. It was regarded, unlike the First Crusade, where tales of heroism and chivalry went back, not this time. In fact, Bernard of Clairvaux did some serious penance and genuinely regretted his cult to crusade, of saying, oh, I screwed up badly. And of course, as I mentioned, there was no attempt to reclaim Edessa. The siege of Damascus was a failure against the Zengian army. And the Western forces themselves were at odds with each other. One of the reasons why the First Crusade was so successful is because the European forces, as much as they disagreed with each other, they were largely working in concert together, and the Islamic forces were divided. Now, in this case, the Islamic forces weren't particularly unified, but they were certainly a little bit more unified than the Zengians. So, curiously enough, by moving in crusade, they actually lost territory during the Second Crusade. They didn't gain any land at all. The Byzantines, on the other hand, were, remember they had recalled their army because they were expecting a fight with the Crusaders. They managed to get out of that. The Byzantines themselves, the virtually no casualties on this at all, and they actually got more control over the territories the Crusader states. In fact, the Byzantines were so good at what they did, the Crusaders trusted them even less than they did before, and accused them of allying with the Turks against them, even though the Byzantines just your funeral. But the other thing is, this started the process to unify the Islamic forces. And remember when I said Zengi himself was actually murdered by one of his slaves, the Frankish slaves, 2 years before the siege of Damascus. So it was actually his son, Nur al-Zen, that began to unite the Seljuk Turks under the Zengi dynasty. Now here's where it gets really important. One of Nur al-Zengi's generals was a Kurd by the name of Shirkuh. Now Shirkuh had a very, very long name, so again, remember in terms of, and it was his nephew. We're going to get to him because this name is etched on Crusader, the history of the Crusades, from here, almost from here on in. So this is how the map looked after the Second Crusade. You had the Seljuk Sultanate. You had basically Edessa during the Crusade ceased to exist. So the county of Edessa was gone. The Seljuk Sultanate was under the control mostly of the Seljuk Turks, specifically Nur al-Zen, although mostly it was under Mosul, Aleppo, and Damascus, sort of as this triangle of power. Less so in the outer regions, and certainly not up in Asia Minor. But you had the Cilician Armenia and the Principality of Antioch, now fully under Byzantine control. Tripoli was still in an independent state. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was there, but actually had a divide. That the Fatimids actually moved in when the Crusader armies were basically defeated. There was something else that happened that I don't have on the slide here, is that not only did the King of France come, but he brought his wife. They left on different ships. I'm just going to leave that one there.
I'm just studying that map.
Yes, you're all good.
That line that goes down from the green area, more or less south, by the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the eastern, is that the River Jordan then?
No, the River Jordan's right here.
Okay.
So there's the Dead Sea. and the Sea of Galilee. So the Jordan is right here. This is largely the top of the Arabian Peninsula, and desert, not a lot of established control, like usually tribal regions and the like. Whereas this is, the Fertile Crescent, of course. Now, even though the Second Crusade officially, the Battle of Damascus was in 1148, but really the Second Crusade petered out. It just, they never really got their footing again. But in a formal sense, it came to a formal end in 1150. But during this time, the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, and now the Seljuks were Sunni Muslim, the Fatimids were Shia. That's an important distinction, that they were constantly battling control. The Fatimids, for various reasons, mostly due to internal squabbling, had become increasingly weak. And so the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in the years following the Second Crusade, wanted to try and take advantage of it. But here's the thing. The reason that they were taking advantage of it is because factions within the Fatimid dynasty were appealing to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, saying, hey, come and help me and I'll help you. And then there was somebody else in the court going to the Seljuks, to the Zengid dynasty, and saying, help us and I'll help you. So the court intrigue was pulling these, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Seljuk Turks, and trying to play the sides off the middle. And in 1154, the Kingdom of Jerusalem actually captured Ascalon, which meant that the Crusaders actually had a base on the northern border of the Fatimid control region. Yes.
These are old Crusaders.
The Kingdom of Jerusalem is, at this point now, the descendants would be almost second or third generation descendants of the First Crusade. Oh yeah. There's all kinds of trade going back and forth.
I'm thinking more of sort of the war skirmishes and
Yeah. And the thing is, Europe still was able to supply, there was still a steady stream of pilgrims coming. There were people who joined the Knights Templar, for example. The Knights Templar went from a charitable organization to being a full-fledged battle group as part of that, as did the Knights Hospitaller. That it became these orders of knights that their loyalty wasn't necessarily to the nation, but to the cause. So this.
Sorry, can I just ask you, at that time, was there the Shia Sunni rivalry?
Oh yeah. The Shia-Sunni rivalry split had been around for it's several hundred years at that point.
You mentioned Shia, the Sunnis involved at all?
Yeah, the Seljuk Turks were Sunni Muslims. So, but inside of that, there were also individual tribes. So you would have Arabs who were Sunni, but you also had Arabs who were Shia. You had most of the Turks were largely Sunni, but the Kurds, I believe, were largely Sunnis as well. I think. I'm pretty sure of that. Because the person that we're coming up to was a Kurd and Sunni.
Yes, it's right. What you just said.
Okay, good. Go on. I'm just making sure I'm getting my factions right. I mean, the thing is, in the same way that Christianity has a whole bunch of denominations, there are also subtleties with this. For example, the Fatimid Empire, maybe or the Fatimid dynasty, maybe you've heard of Ismaili Muslims. Okay. Ismailis are the descendants of the Fatimids. Okay? But the fact that as a political entity, they weren't alone for this world. So remember how I said that you had the various courts. One side was appealing to the Crusaders and to the Crusader states, specifically the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and then you had others who were going to, well, in particular, there's one person who was, Shalom, was particularly duplicitous, that he went to Nuremberg for support for their internal squabbles. And Zengi said, sure, I'll just send my army down. And very quickly, Shor found himself vizier of Egypt, but had no power of his own because his own general Shurkur, I'm not pronouncing it right, but was the de facto ruler, and Shawara was a figurehead, and he didn't like that. So he then went to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, to Al-Marik, and in 1164 they invaded Egypt. They said, "Well, you invited us, so we're going to come." And so the Nur al-Zengi then decided, well, drew them away by actually attacking Antioch, and then very suddenly the army that was trying to invade Egypt said, "No, we got to go back and help Antioch." So they pulled out. And eventually, there was a lot of back and forth going on, but in Shurkur established control over Egypt. Ultimately, the Shurkur's forces gained control over Egypt. He became, he was the de facto, in fact, the ruler of Egypt, and then he died 2 months later. But his nephew, and maybe you've heard this name, Saladin.
Saladin Ayyubi.
Mm-hmm. He was the one, the great unifier, who became initially the regent of Egypt, and eventually he claimed the title of Sultan of Egypt. And effectively, at this point in time, the Fatimid dynasty was gone. But here's the thing: is that Saladin was expected to be loyal to the Seljuks, to the Zengids, but he said no, and effectively established his own empire, his own control. But now here's the thing: Saladin was a Kurd, not a Turk. So so there was a little bit of tribe going on, but also Saladin also had a reputation of being a particularly devout Muslim as well, and so he saw it as his goal to reclaim Jerusalem, because unlike the Zengids, who were trying to just claim territory amongst the Islamic powers, Saladin was, economically captured the coastlines, but it did mean moving against the Crusaders, and of course was able to rally the people to retake Jerusalem and bring it back under Islamic control, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque in particular, the third holiest site in Islam, was under the control of the Crusaders and used as a palace or a stable, depending on who you talk to. It was probably a bit of both. And so he was able to unite the forces with this, and he united the various Islamic dynasties because he was also a very good diplomat. I'm also keeping an eye on time here. And curiously enough, when the Crusaders encountered him, particularly during the Third Crusade, they regarded him as a chivalrous knight. Now, don't get me wrong; he could be pretty vicious. He was that there's one report that in defeating an enemy, he basically had them all killed by beheading. But then again, that was a pretty common, that was actually relatively humane at the time, because the Crusaders would kind of cut you open and do all kinds of different things. But in 1187, Saladin would, it wasn't specifically, he didn't lay siege to Jerusalem, although he sort of did. It was actually, Jerusalem would fall in 1187, but that would be because it was actually right here. It's the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which was here. Jerusalem is down here, and that effectively, on the battlefield, decimated the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as well as a lot of the other forces. And if you notice here, all of a sudden, all of this area is under Saladin's control. This little blue spot here is all that was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The County of Tripoli actually escaped with the least amount of territorial loss, and then Antioch as well. And so this was a major blow to the west, but it was a major boost to the Islamic various Islamic powers, is that united under Saladin, they were able to take back what had been taken 88 years before. I've already showed you on the map where that ended up. But of course, the Europeans, the fall of Jerusalem itself would be the trigger for the Third Crusade. And the Abbasid Caliphate would be what Saladin would eventually found, and would have basically the territory. I do have a map, but not here. There would be North Africa up to the edge of what is modern day Libya, down the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. Just trying to remember. And then most of the Fertile Crescent as well, stretching further to the east. And so this eventually, this is the quick Cole's Notes version of the Third Crusade. We're going to pick up the Third Crusade and move forward. Because of course, when Jerusalem fell, in the same way that perhaps even more so, that when Jerusalem fell, there was that the call of the crusade was almost immediate. But of course, campaigns taking time. The actual campaign was a three-year period, and this is where finally Richard the Lionheart, becomes involved. And they would recover. I'll get into more detail next week. They did manage to recover a lot of the coastal territory, but they never got Jerusalem back. And the Fourth Crusade never even got close to even Antioch. And the Fourth Crusade was such an unmitigated disaster that even though people were, the usual, if you go on crusade, you'll get an indulgence. Everybody everybody who went on the Fourth Crusade was excommunicated. We get to that next week. And of course, what would happen is that fall, there would be this just ever, you had, remember, 11th century, one crusade, 12th century, two crusades, and then the 13th century, six. And one of the things that I didn't even touch on today, remember how I've limited my scope to the military actions in the Middle East. The Second Crusade also had, remember that whole call, the reaction to the call for the Second Crusade with this initial reaction was mid? Well, in addition to the Second Crusade, which was a military failure, there were others going, well, there are things that we can do closer to home. It marked the beginning of what is called the Reconquista, the reclaiming of Spain. So there were, during the time of the Second Crusade, there were military campaigns to push Muslim forces out of Spain. But also, it wasn't specifically against Muslims either. It was also moving into Eastern Europe, and that was called the Wendish Crusade. But it also began to mark a time where the term crusade started to be thrown around more and more and more, and it meant less and less and less. But because of our we have to focus on one spot. That's where we ended up. So next week, because I didn't want to keep you here all night, we're going to pick up in some detail about the Third Crusade. Because the Third Crusade had military successes on the part of the European forces, whereas the Second Crusade did not. The Third Crusade did, and there actually became a certain grudging respect for each other at that point in time. That in fact, Saladin in Europe was very well regarded. In fact, he was almost seen as the noble foe. In some respects. And Saladin took quite a liking to Richard I himself. So, even though they were very distinct enemies, there was something about that. So, I'm going to be touching on that. But then we start getting into this rapid fire of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th Crusade. All of which were functionally failures. The Third Crusade really was the last one that was a victory on the part of the Europeans. I have to emphasize that. From the Islamic point of view, they weren't failures, because they were militarily successful in repelling it. But and we go from there. So, any questions?
John, I have one question.
Oh,
that is the relationship between the Kurds and the Seljuks later on. Did that evolve during the Fourth Crusade and thereafter?
That one I'm going to have to. That's going to have to be part of my research, because the unfortunate historical reality is that quite often tribalism is heavily involved in a part of this. And so Saladin, I think, was a Kurd, but he did manage to unite Turks and Arabs under his control, or at least under his governance. But of course, we do know, in terms of looking at things from a modern perspective, the relationship between Turks and Kurds these days is not very good. Never mind in terms of the Armenians as well. And I think some of that has to do with what happened under the Ottoman Empire centuries after this period. But at the same time, there is tribalism at play. Saladin was successful in uniting it, or at least was a strong enough leader administratively and militarily to be able to unify them for a time. Now, one factor that will also come in next time and the week after is that eventually, especially during the 13th century, while these multiple crusades are also going on, there was another actor that came into play, and that's the Mongols. Because the Mongols got as far as Damascus in terms of their eastern expansion. So you have a third major power coming into play during this period as well. So now I saw.
I still don't understand, why did they go after Damascus? Was it an important city?
Your question, that's a very good question. Why did they go after Damascus? Truthfully, even today, historians are going, what a dumb move. And perhaps, in some respects, they might have seen Damascus as being strategically relevant in terms of pushing the Turks back, where in reality, they, in fact, for a short time, already had Damascus in their pocket. But maybe they didn't trust the governor or something akin to that. It was widely seen that the choice of Damascus during the Second Crusade was an unmitigated disaster in terms of a strategic goal, in terms of a strategic goal, in terms of a political goal, because it had the exact opposite effect of what they wanted. That not only did they not succeed in getting Damascus, that they might have had they done, learned from the Byzantines, negotiated an alliance, and then gone after Aleppo or even reclaiming Edessa to weaken the Zengi Turks. So why did they go after Damascus? I have no idea. That wasn't a great choice.
John, I have one suggestion. And that is it anything to do with the relationship of Damascus with John the Baptist?
That's a good question. I don't know, because that puts it into the realm of. Generally, they were pretty good in terms of thinking strategically and not thinking in terms of some of the figures of faith, because there were certainly in the early church, Damascus was a development point of early Christians. You have the story of Paul on the road to Damascus. So there may have been some degree of maybe we'll have a road to Damascus moment because Paul had his conversion experience on the way. Perhaps that played a role. So yes, it probably it may have played a role, but it would not. But it was certainly not a smart tactical choice.
But the head of St. John the Baptist is in Damascus. John the Baptist.
Well, at least the artifact of it. And certainly there may have been. I haven't found any specific planning literature that was the case. Although we do know that the king of Jerusalem and the Knights Templar were the ones who said, "We go after Damascus." They were the ones who influenced that decision. So there could have been some of that at play, but it was argued tactically. Bonnie, I'll come to you second because I've got one more.
Oh, yeah, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, one more question and then back to one.
Okay. In the Crusader states,
Yes.
after the Crusade, what type of people were there? Were they Christians, Jews, Muslims?
Yes.
Which one? All of them?
Yeah.
Oh, so they all got along?
Oh yeah. Well, when you have food to trade and money to spend, generally people would get along. But
so the different religions lived there.
There were still Muslims living in the region, but many had fled. But many, certainly a number of stayed. It wasn't wiped out completely. But what did develop was a European hierarchy. That generally there was a largely French aristocracy,
So they're basically Christian.
Latin Christians at the top. And then as you went further down the social structure, it became more and more diverse. And but at the same time, the massacre of Jerusalem was substantial enough that they did have to repopulate Jerusalem as well. But eventually there was a reasonable mix, but it's certainly the Crusader states heavily favored Latin-speaking Christianity, and if you were not in that, you were not that even Christians at the time had a lot of rights at the time relative to the aristocracy, but it was well, yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on that question. What was so special about Damascus that Christians wanted, the Muslims, everybody seems to want, like, was there a goal behind or something?
The difficulty is, I unfortunately have never been there, but quite often when you have, quite often the reason that certain places are claimed is because of strategic trade routes. And Damascus certainly would have had trade route access into the interior.
And it could just be that the king of Jerusalem figured out that the Muslims were on their way there and wanted to beat them, so we had a trade route.
Perhaps well, they had long since known that Zengi and presumably his son would have ambitions on Damascus, but instead of allying with the governor, they said, well, we'll take it for ourselves, throwing the governor into the hands of the Turks. Look here, have an ally. No, but well, the art of war existed. It was a few trade routes and a little further east. At that point in time, and of course Machiavelli hadn't shown up yet. But the Byzantines were very good at it. Really what they should have done, the trouble is they didn't trust the Byzantines to negotiate that, but the Byzantines might have actually done some good, but they did. So, anyway, it's 5 minutes to 9. Any other questions? If not, I did fulfill my promise and I was in shorts tonight. We actually have a fan in here. I tried to get running, but it's not working. It actually vents the heat out here. But if ever you're in here and you feel too hot, just run up those stairs to the landing there where the sun has been shining all day. Come back down here and it feels like it's air conditioned. So like I said, next week we launch ourselves into this and pretty much move into the various Crusades, and then start talking about the aftermath and the overall effect of what the Crusades, the effect that the Crusades eventually would have, and the impact that they would have even now. The even now part is actually 2 weeks from today, but it's still being able to understand the background to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Right.